There was a time when she was untouchable, when the world didn't ask if Ronda Rousey would win, but how fast. She was the queen of violence, a fighter built for war, a champion forged in pain. But what happens when the unbeatable meets the inevitable? When dominance turns to delusion and the fall is faster than the rise? This is the story of Ronda Rousey, the rise, the reign, and the ruin. The unstoppable force and the whispers of doubt. Ronda Rousey wasn't just another fighter. She was a force of nature. From the moment she stepped into the octagon, she carried an aura of invincibility, a presence so dominant that her fights felt less like contests and more like executions. She moved with surgical precision, her judo throws snapping opponents onto the canvas before they even understood what was happening. And then came the armbar, an inevitable, inescapable sentence. Each victory was faster than the last. Each opponent left broken, bewildered, and humiliated. The UFC had never seen anything like her. She wasn't just winning, she was obliterating. But with every triumph, the whispers of doubt began to grow. Fans, analysts, even fellow fighters started murmuring the unthinkable. What if she wasn't as good as everyone believed? What if her dominance was a mirage, propped up by weak competition in a sport still finding its footing in women's divisions? Ronda didn't care. She basked in the glory, believing her own legend, drowning out the skeptics with the sound of roaring crowds. But the higher she climbed, the more dangerous the fall became, and she never saw it coming. A legacy born in tragedy. Before she was the most feared woman in combat sports, Ronda Rousey was just a little girl who lost everything. Her father, the man who told her she was destined for greatness, was taken by a cruel twist of fate. A freak accident shattered his back, but the real wound was deeper. Doctors gave him no hope. Paralysis, suffering, a slow, undignified decline. He refused to let that be his story. One cold morning, he drove to a secluded lake, sealed his fate with a hose in the exhaust, and left behind a daughter too young to understand why. But she would understand soon enough. Grief turned into fire. The little girl who once struggled to form words due to a speech disorder now let her actions speak louder than anything. She fought with a purpose, with a rage that couldn't be contained. Judo became her weapon, discipline became her religion, and pain became her fuel. Every throw, every submission, every ruthless finish inside the cage, it wasn't just about winning. It was about proving that her father was right, that she was meant to be extraordinary. The ascent of a killer. Ronda didn't just enter MMA, she stormed into it like a hurricane. From her very first professional fight, it was clear she wasn't here to participate. She was here to destroy. Victories came in seconds, not rounds. Opponents barely had time to breathe before they were trapped in the death grip of her armbar, forced to tap or risk leaving the cage with a broken limb. The sport had never seen this kind of violence from a woman before. She wasn't just beating contenders, she was devouring them. The world watched in awe. Dana White, the UFC president who once swore women would never fight in the UFC, changed his mind overnight. Ronda Rousey wasn't just a fighter. She was an event, a spectacle, a money-making machine. Headlines called her the female Mike Tyson. Celebrities lined up to meet her. Hollywood wanted her on the big screen. But while the world was falling in love with her, something dangerous was happening beneath the surface. Ronda believed her own myth, and myths, no matter how powerful, are always destined to be tested. The birth of an untouchable champion. The octagon became her kingdom, and every woman who dared step inside was just another sacrifice. Ronda Rousey wasn't fighting for decisions. She was hunting for annihilation. With each arm she snapped, each opponent she dismantled in under a minute. The myth around her grew thicker. She had the aggression of a street brawler, the technical brilliance of an Olympic judoka, and the aura of an unstoppable machine. The UFC had never seen dominance like this, and neither had the world. She became the first ever UFC women's champion without even throwing a punch in the promotion. Dana White wrapped the belt around her waist, and just like that, Ronda Rousey became the face of women's MMA. But it wasn't just about the fights. She was rewriting history, endorsements, talk shows, movies. Everywhere she went, she carried the swagger of a prize fighter who had already won. To the world, she was a phenomenon. To her opponents, she was a nightmare. And to herself, she was invincible. Blood in the water. But invincibility is an illusion, and illusions can only hold if no one dares to shatter them. As Ronda stacked up win after win, whispers in the dark became murmurs, and murmurs turned into quiet rebellion. Some fighters started to believe they saw cracks in the armor. What happens if she can't take someone down? What happens if she gets hit? Ronda never entertained those questions because she never had to. Opponents fell too quickly for doubts to manifest. But behind the scenes, she was changing. The hunger that had once driven her was now drowned in Hollywood lights and media obligations. She wasn't just training for fights anymore. She was juggling movies, sponsorships, and fame. The sport she once consumed with obsession was no longer her only battlefield. And lurking in the shadows was someone who had been watching. Someone who had the answer to the questions no one had dared to ask. Her name was Holly Holm, and she wasn't coming to fight Ronda Rousey. She was coming to end her. The first taste of fear. The night was supposed to be just another execution, another quick finish, another armbar, another opponent broken under the weight of the Ronda Rousey machine. The UFC packed over 56,000 fans into Melbourne's Docklands Stadium, the biggest audience in the promotion's history, all to witness their queen defend her throne. But beneath the confidence, behind the snarl and the bravado, something felt off. Holly Holm stood across from her, a former world boxing champion, a precise, calculated striker with ice in her veins. She didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She wasn't buying into the legend of Ronda Rousey. And when the fight began, it was clear this wasn't going to be like the others. Holm moved like a ghost, dodging, countering, punishing Ronda for every reckless step forward. For the first time, the Predator looked confused. And then it happened. The moment that rewrote history, a perfectly timed, bone-crushing head kick that turned the unstoppable force into a motionless heap on the canvas. The fall from the heavens. The image of Ronda Rousey lying unconscious became an instant piece of sports history. The knockout was brutal, but the silence that followed was deafening. The golden girl of the UFC, the invincible warrior, had been shattered. The world that once worshipped her now reveled in her destruction. Fans, media, even fighters who once praised her began tearing down the myth piece by piece. Ronda disappeared. No press conference, no interviews, no post-fight statement. The woman who once ruled the sport with an iron grip had evaporated into the shadows. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months, and still, nothing. She wasn't just beaten, she was erased. The question now wasn't if she could return, but if she could even survive the humiliation. And while she spiraled in silence, the sport she helped build moved on without her. The haunting silence. For the first time in her career, Ronda Rousey wasn't the one making headlines. She was the headline. And not for her dominance, not for her victories, but for her absence. The same media that once glorified her now dissected her like vultures picking apart a fallen giant. The knockout replayed on every screen, every social media feed, every late-night talk show. The world laughed. The myth had been shattered. And Ronda, she disappeared. No training footage, no statements, no glimpses of the warrior who once stood unbreakable. Rumors swirled. Was she done? Would she ever fight again? Some fighters, some champions, when they fall, they rise again. But Ronda was never built to lose. She had spent her entire life believing she was different, destined, untouchable. And now with one kick, that belief was gone. In its place, a suffocating void, return of the ghost. When Ronda Rousey finally emerged from the shadows, she didn't return to the fight world. She went to a talk show, not to break down her loss, not to credit Holly Holm, but to let the world in on a secret she had considered ending it all. I was sitting in the corner of the hospital room, thinking about killing myself. I had nothing. No career, no future. I was nothing. The revelation stunned the world. For years, Ronda had been the face of invincibility, of grit, of defiance. Now she was admitting what no one had ever seen. She was human, vulnerable, broken. But even in that moment of raw honesty, she clung to one last hope: redemption. And that redemption had a name: Amanda Nunes. The world watched as the UFC announced her return, but this wasn't the same Ronda Rousey. The hunger, the fire, it was all gone. She wasn't coming back for greatness. She was coming back to erase the stain of failure. And in doing so, she would walk straight into her final nightmare. The UFC 207 poster said it all. Amanda Nunes stood on one side, fierce, dangerous, the reigning champion. On the other, Ronda Rousey, expressionless, hollow, a ghost of the woman who once ruled the sport. There were no press tours, no interviews, no pre-fight trash talk. Ronda refused to speak to the media. She wanted no distractions, no reminders of the world outside. She had convinced herself that this was the moment of her resurrection, that her story would not end with a head kick in Melbourne. But those who watched closely saw something different. The confidence was gone. The aura had faded. And standing across from her wasn't just another fighter. Amanda Nunes was a lioness, a cold-blooded finisher, a woman who feasted on pressure. She wasn't here to welcome Ronda back. She was here to end her for good. 48 seconds of oblivion. The bell rang, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like the old days. Ronda marched forward, hands up, ready to reclaim her throne. But within seconds, reality came crashing down, her mind unable to process what was happening. Punches rained down like gunfire, each one stripping away the myth, the legacy, the last remnants of invincibility. 48 seconds. That's all it took. Ronda Rousey, once the most feared woman in combat sports, stood defenseless, glassy-eyed as the referee rushed in to save her from further destruction. She didn't argue, she didn't protest. She simply turned away, walking out of the octagon like a warrior who knew her war was over. The legend of Ronda Rousey had died that night, and she would never fight again. The death of a legend. Ronda Rousey didn't stick around. No post-fight interview, no words, no goodbye. She simply vanished. The arena, the fans, the flashing cameras, none of it mattered anymore. She had spent years building an empire, a myth of invincibility, only to see it torn down in less than a minute. The headlines were merciless. Exposed. Overrated. Hype train derailed. The same media that once worshipped her now picked apart her downfall like scavengers circling a corpse. She had been the queen, the untouchable, the one-woman revolution. Now she was just a name on a growing list of fighters Amanda Nunes had obliterated. The sport moved on without her, and for the first time, Ronda had to accept a brutal truth. MMA didn't need her anymore. The Great Escape. Ronda Rousey never fought again. There was no comeback, no revenge, no dramatic return to reclaim her throne. Instead, she ran from the sport entirely, retreating to the one place where victories were scripted and pain was choreographed. Professional wrestling. The WWE welcomed her with open arms. The octagon had stripped her down, exposed her weaknesses, and left her shattered. But in the world of wrestling, she could rewrite the narrative. She was still rowdy Ronda Rousey, still a star, still a dominant force, but something had changed. The snarl, the confidence, the fire. It wasn't real anymore. She played the part, threw the punches, smiled for the cameras. But the truth was written in her eyes. She had escaped the fight game because she knew if she ever stepped back into a real cage, into a real fight, the ending would always be the same, and she wasn't willing to die in the fire a second time. A legacy under fire. Ronda Rousey's name was once synonymous with dominance, but now it became a battlefield of debate. Was she truly a pioneer, or was she a carefully manufactured illusion? The MMA world divided. Some credited her with single-handedly bringing women's fighting into the mainstream, the first true female superstar of combat sports. Others saw her as a product of hype, a fighter who thrived in an era of underdeveloped competition, but crumbled the moment she faced real adversity. Her refusal to acknowledge defeat only fueled the criticism. She never publicly gave credit to Holly Holm or Amanda Nunes. She never admitted she had been beaten by better fighters. Instead, she spoke of exhaustion, of pressure, of media obligations that drained her will. To some, it sounded like excuses. To others, it sounded like a broken woman trying to make sense of her own downfall. Either way, one thing was clear. Ronda Rousey, the fighter, was gone. The price of greatness. Fame is a double-edged sword. It lifts you to unimaginable heights, but when you fall, the same hands that once praised you are the first to bury you. Ronda Rousey learned this the hard way. In her prime, she was untouchable. A global icon, a pay-per-view monster, a Hollywood star. But the moment she lost, the adoration turned to ridicule, the cheers to jeers, the admiration to mockery. She had spent her entire life proving she was different, stronger, tougher, unbreakable. But in the end, she wasn't. She was human, and the world never forgives its fallen heroes. The UFC moved on. New champions rose. The sport she helped build no longer had a place for her. And so, Ronda did what many greats before her had done. She walked away. Not in triumph, not in redemption, but in silence. Because in the end, even legends can't outrun time. From warrior to outsider. The octagon had defined her. It had been her battlefield, her kingdom, her sanctuary, but now it was a place she dared not return to. The sport had moved forward, and Ronda Rousey was no longer a part of it. She had become an outsider in the very world she helped build. Fighters she once overshadowed had taken her place. New stars had emerged, new champions reigned, and her name was now spoken in the past tense. She never sat cage-side at UFC events. She never mentored rising prospects. She never embraced the new era of women's MMA. Instead, she distanced herself completely, as if to erase the scars of a past that still haunted her. Some called it pride, others called it fear. Either way, the fight game had closed its doors on her. The unfinished story. Every great champion gets their moment of redemption, their second chance to reclaim glory. But for Ronda Rousey, that moment never came. There was no rematch against Holm, no desperate final stand against Nunes, no farewell fight to leave the sport on her own terms. Instead, there was only silence. And that silence spoke volumes, because deep down, Ronda knew If she came back, she would lose again. And losing wasn't something she was built for. She had spent her entire life winning, breaking barriers, proving doubters wrong. But the fight game had caught up. The world had changed. And for the first time, Ronda Rousey had no place in it. She left the sport without a word, without a final war cry. But that silence would become its own kind of statement, one that still lingers to this day. The myth and the truth. Time has a way of rewriting history. For some, Ronda Rousey remains the greatest female fighter of all time, a trailblazer who shattered barriers and forced the world to take women's MMA seriously. But for others, she is a cautionary tale. A fighter who thrived in a shallow division, protected by hype, only to collapse the moment she faced true adversity. The truth? It lies somewhere in between. Ronda was a force of nature, a wrecking machine who revolutionized women's MMA. But she was also flawed, fragile, and ultimately unprepared for what came after dominance. She wasn't built for the long war, only for the short, violent victories that made her a star. And when those victories stopped coming, she had no answer. Legend or ghost. Today, Ronda Rousey exists in the echoes of the sport. Her name still carries weight, but her presence is gone. She doesn't call fights, doesn't train rising prospects, doesn't share the wisdom of her experience. She is not a mentor, not a coach, not a returning hero. She is a ghost, haunting a sport that no longer belongs to her. But legends are not erased so easily. The debate over her legacy will rage on. Some will argue she was overrated. Others will insist she was a pioneer. But in the end, the facts remain. She changed the game, ruled it with an iron grip, and then disappeared into the shadows. And maybe, just maybe, that was always how it was meant to end. The last page of a fallen empire. The octagon lights dimmed on Ronda Rousey long ago, but her name still lingers in the halls of MMA history. She was the first, the fiercest, the face of a revolution. For a time, she was unbreakable, a myth carved into reality. But myths are fragile things, and when the fall came, it was not a stumble, it was a plummet. Yet the story of Ronda Rousey is not just one of dominance or downfall. It is the story of a fighter who changed the landscape forever. Women's MMA is what it is today because of her. Without Ronda, there would be no Amanda Nunes, no Valentina Shevchenko, no rising stars standing on the foundation she built. She was both the architect and the sacrifice. The legacy she couldn't escape. Legends do not fade quietly, and Ronda Rousey's name will never be forgotten. But she is no longer a warrior, no longer the storm she once was. She has left the fight game behind, retreating into a life far removed from the chaos of battle. But the ghosts of the past never truly vanish. The old highlights, the bitter defeats, the questions of what if, they follow her. They whisper in the silence she left behind. And maybe, just maybe, on some nights, when the world is quiet and the lights have long since faded, Ronda Rousey wonders what would have happened if she had fought just one more time.